The autumn of 1977 in Burlington, Vermont, was crisp and golden, the streets lined with leaves that had turned shades of amber and scarlet. Lydia Hart walked briskly along Church Street, backpack slung over her shoulder, humming quietly to herself as she recited lines from the latest poetry assignment. She was 22, a senior at the University of Vermont, majoring in literature, a young woman whose curiosity about the world was as wide as her smile. She carried notebooks filled with scribbled ideas, scraps of poems and letters she intended to write but never found the time. Lydia's friends described her as bright, tenacious, and impossibly kind. A student who never hesitated to help others, whether mentoring freshmen or volunteering at the local library. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. At home, the Hart family's household was warm but quiet. Her parents, Helen and George Hart, had created a home filled with encouragement and love. Helen, a high school teacher, understood Lydia's dreams in a way only a parent who had once stood in the classroom could. George, who worked for the state transportation department, often returned home tired but always made time for a family dinner, asking about homework, lectures, and the small victories that punctuated a college student's life. Simon, Lydia's younger brother, idolized her. He followed her through the yard on weekends, carrying her bags to the car, eager to hear her laugh, to catch the stories she told with her vibrant energy. That December, Lydia left her home after a family dinner, promising to meet a friend at a small cafe near the university. She had a list of errands to run, books to return to the library, and an essay to finish for a comparative literature class. By the following morning, she had vanished. Her parents assumed she had stayed over at a friend's house or gotten caught in the cold Vermont weather, which could be unpredictable and harsh in winter. Simon waited for her to return, pacing the living room in frustration, glancing repeatedly at the clock. The hours dragged on, stretching into the next day, and the worry in Helen and George's eyes deepened. By the end of the week, the Hart family had reported her missing. Police officers arrived, took statements, and promised to begin a search. Detective Samuel Hayes, a seasoned officer with more than 2 decades on the force, was assigned to the case. Hayes was methodical, relying heavily on procedure and protocol, often skeptical of witness intuition and circumstantial evidence. Alongside him, a young rookie, Detective Fiona Cole, had been assigned. Fiona had joined the Burlington Police Department only a year prior and was eager to prove herself. She was sharp, perceptive, and unafraid to ask questions that more experienced officers avoided. From the outset, the investigation faced challenges. Burlington was a small city, and the disappearance of a young college student, while concerning, was not uncommon in police records. Early leads were inconsistent. A janitor who claimed to have seen a woman matching Lydia's description near a construction site, a student who remembered seeing a stranger loitering near the library, and a taxi driver who mentioned picking up a young woman who seemed anxious. All were pursued half-heartedly, dismissed, or lost in the shuffle. Evidence that might have been critical, a strand of hair, faint tire marks near the campus parking lot, a partially torn notebook found by the library, was catalogued but never thoroughly analyzed. Weeks turned into months. Lydia's disappearance became a shadow over her family. Helen spent evenings going through Lydia's old journals, searching for clues, anything that might explain her sudden absence. George called in favors, speaking with colleagues, neighbors, and even professors, attempting to piece together a timeline. Simon, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, became obsessed with checking her usual spots, cafes, libraries, and lecture halls, but found only traces of her presence, no answers. Then, in early 1979, nearly 15 months after Lydia had vanished, hikers discovered human remains in a remote wash outside Burlington. The scene was quiet, isolated, almost hidden from the eyes of the world. It was there, among rocks and overgrown brush, that Lydia's life ended, far from the safety of home or the warmth of her family. The medical examiner confirmed her identity, and the realization hit the Hart family with devastating force. The months of hope and uncertainty transformed into grief and anger. Detective Cole and Hayes returned to the case, now with a sense of urgency amplified by the tragic discovery. But even then, the investigation faltered. Evidence had been mishandled in the early days, crucial witness accounts had grown hazy, and leads had long since gone cold. The notebooks Lydia had carried, the journal pages that might have revealed her last interactions, were smudged, faded, and only partially preserved. The authorities, already struggling with limited technology and resources, could not reconstruct the chain of events fully. Amid the confusion, a subtle thread began to emerge. A local man, Caleb Moreland, known in the community for his odd behavior and solitary nature, was noted in early witness reports as having been in the area around Lydia's last known movements. No one at the time connected him directly to the crime, and the mention of his name was filed away with dozens of others. Yet even these small hints, the brief flickers of suspicion, would later prove to be critical in understanding the true horror of Lydia's fate. Moreland's presence in the area, his erratic schedule, and fleeting sightings near the university would remain largely unnoticed by investigators preoccupied with procedural norms and traditional expectations. Cole, however, could not ignore the subtle unease surrounding Moreland. She noted inconsistencies in witness statements, an observation from a cafe owner about a man who watched Lydia too intently, a neighbor reporting a strange car parked near the campus late at night. These details, seemingly minor, sparked her intuition. Hayes, rooted in experience but wary of speculation, resisted pursuing what he saw as circumstantial. Their professional tension underscored the generational divide between traditional policing and emerging investigative intuition, a theme that would ripple throughout the decades of the unfolding case. Lydia's social circle provided additional context. Her roommate, Rachel, described Lydia as cautious but independent, noting that she rarely accepted rides from strangers and had been wary of a man she briefly encountered at the library months earlier. Lydia's friends remembered her mentioning a local community event where she had felt uneasy, though she did not explain why. These seemingly trivial moments became pieces of a puzzle that, at the time, nobody could assemble. One evening, Fiona Cole sat alone in the dimly lit precinct office, reviewing the case files. She carefully spread out photographs, statements, and maps, tracing Lydia's last known route from campus to her home, and finally to the wash where her remains were discovered. She noted small details, the timing of her classes, the likely bus routes she would have taken, the darkened alleys she would have passed. The inconsistencies in witness statements nagged at her mind. One clue in particular, a single thread of dark fabric found snagged on a bush near the wash, was overlooked in the initial investigation. Its significance was not apparent at the time, but Cole filed it mentally, knowing that what seems minor today could become pivotal tomorrow. Meanwhile, the Hart family continued to grieve. Helen and George organized community vigils, searching for solace in numbers and shared hope. Simon, now a teenager, learned to navigate a world that seemed less safe than he had imagined. Each day without answers left an invisible scar, and the unrelenting uncertainty tested the bonds of family love and resilience. Cole often visited them, offering updates she knew were limited. Yet her presence provided a thread of connection between the living and the unanswered questions surrounding Lydia's death. Through the winter and into the spring, the investigation saw little progress. Caleb Moreland's name appeared sporadically in police notes, local disputes, minor arrests, odd reports, but never with a definitive link to Lydia's disappearance. Hayes dismissed these mentions as irrelevant, while Cole carefully cataloged them, sensing a larger pattern emerging. She recognized that a careful, methodical review of the evidence, paired with attention to human behavior and instinct, might reveal what had been missed. By the spring of 1979, as snow melted and the first green shoots appeared along Burlington streets, the case remained unresolved. The wash, where Lydia's remains were found, became a place of quiet remembrance, known only to those who had searched for her, those who mourned her, and the small group of investigators who refused to let the trail grow cold. Cole returned often, walking the paths Lydia had taken, trying to imagine what might have happened in the hours before her abduction. Each detail seemed both vivid and impossibly distant, a life lived fully and stolen violently. Small clues began to converge. A neighbor recalled seeing a shadowy figure in the alley behind Lydia's apartment building on the night she disappeared. A taxi driver remembered a passenger matching her description getting into a car with someone unknown. And a bus driver mentioned a man who lingered near the terminal, fidgeting, observing the young women boarding at night. Taken individually, these details might have seemed inconsequential. Together, they suggested a presence, a silent predator who moved unnoticed, relying on the very normalcy of his environment as camouflage. As Cole pieced together the timeline, she realized that Lydia's last movements traced a path through parts of Burlington that were quiet, unpatrolled, and poorly lit. These factors, combined with the dismissive attitude of early investigators, created a perfect storm. The case was no longer just about Lydia Hart. It became a portrait of institutional failure, human oversight, and the stark consequences of disbelief. Even as Hayes argued that enough had been done, Cole's persistence kept the investigation alive. She met with professors, students, and community members, piecing together stories, cross-referencing sightings and drawing the invisible threads connecting them. In doing so, she began to see a pattern, one that hinted at broader, darker implications. Caleb Moreland's occasional presence in these reports, minor though it seemed, formed a pattern of proximity and opportunity that could not be ignored. By the summer of 1979, Cole had amassed enough notes to approach Hayes with a tentative theory. Moreland had been near Lydia's apartment, her campus, and the wash multiple times over months. While circumstantial, the alignment of dates, locations, and eyewitness accounts demanded attention. Hayes remained skeptical, a tension between intuition and protocol. Yet even his experience could not dismiss the weight of cumulative evidence. In the late evening, as the sun dipped behind Lake Champlain, Cole walked through the wash where Lydia's remains had been found. The scent of earth and decay mingled with the fading warmth of summer. She knelt near the site, tracing the paths Lydia likely took, imagining the fear and confusion, the final moments of a young life cut short. A single thread of dark fabric caught on a jagged branch, almost invisible but unmistakable to her trained eyes. In that moment, the case shifted from a cold report to a personal mission, one that would span decades, unraveling a web of missed opportunities, systemic failures, and, ultimately, the sinister life of the man who had taken Lydia Hart from the world. The investigation, though stalled, had ignited a quiet fire within Fiona Cole. She knew that justice for Lydia would require persistence, courage, and the willingness to question authority, intuition, and evidence alike. The road ahead would be long, and the full story would take years to reveal, but the foundation had been laid. As the night settled over Burlington, with the city's lights reflected in Lake Champlain's dark waters, one question lingered. How many other lives had been touched, stolen, or ignored while the system turned a blind eye? And perhaps most importantly, how many people, guided by instinct and compassion, would refuse to look away? If you were Detective Fiona Cole in 1977, faced with limited evidence and institutional resistance, how would you have pursued Lydia Hart's case differently? The spring of 1980 in Burlington had a chill that refused to lift, a cold reminder that winter's grip could stretch long into the year. Detective Fiona Cole returned to the precinct with a renewed determination, yet a gnawing sense of frustration settled in her chest. Lydia Hart's case remained unsolved, a specter that shadowed every decision she made. Samuel Hayes, now showing streaks of gray in his hair and deepening lines across his face, had grown quieter with age. Where once he had been skeptical of Cole's intuition, he now listened more. Yet the constraints of the department and the limitations of forensic science stifled their efforts. Despite their persistence, the investigation seemed to stagnate. The small city of Burlington had little capacity for interjurisdictional collaboration, and files from neighboring towns were often delayed or incomplete. By 1981, it became apparent that Lydia's disappearance was only the first of many threads they would struggle to follow. It was in this context that Caleb Moreland quietly moved beyond Vermont. A man whose ordinary appearance belied his cunning and brutality, Moreland adapted easily to new towns, blending seamlessly into local communities while leaving a trail of victims that would remain undetected for years. Each new city, each new disappearance, echoed patterns that Cole and Hayes had begun to recognize but could not yet connect. The limitations of the time, primitive forensic techniques, lack of centralized databases, and poor interstate communication enabled him to continue with impunity. In Concord, New Hampshire in the summer of 1983, Jasmine Lee, a 19-year-old college student studying graphic design, vanished after an evening shift at a local cafe. Her family, like the Harts before them, launched frantic searches, placing flyers around the town, calling police and pleading with neighbors for information. Detectives followed up on leads, interviewed strangers, and scoured known hangouts, yet Jasmine remained missing. Her disappearance was chalked up by some local authorities as a possible runaway case, a tragically common dismissal that failed to recognize the dark pattern emerging across New England. Fiona Cole, now 4 years into her career, reviewed the Concord files when they crossed her desk in Burlington. She noticed subtle similarities to Lydia's case. Young women, alone, last seen in urban areas near public transit, and reports of a man seen nearby. She began to maintain a mental log of locations and descriptions, trying to trace any patterns, yet the lack of interagency coordination meant her notes remained isolated, private, and unverified. Hayes, increasingly frustrated by bureaucracy and local politics, began voicing concerns over how the system failed victims. He had been on the force for nearly 30 years and had seen this cycle repeat in ways that left him hollow. By 1987, Moreland had shifted once again, this time to Buffalo, New York. Sophia Ramirez, 24, a kindergarten teacher with an infectious smile, disappeared from a downtown bus stop late one evening. Her parents, Maria, Hector Ramirez, immediately contacted local authorities. Police conducted searches, but evidence was sparse: a footprint in a mud patch, a broken strap from a handbag, and a single strand of hair. None of these clues were preserved properly or analyzed with the care they required. The case became a cold file in the Buffalo Police Archives. The Ramirez family left to navigate a grief compounded by confusion and helplessness. Throughout the 1980s, Cole continued to age alongside the cases she investigated. She had married briefly, had children, and yet the image of Lydia's smiling face haunted her every step. Hayes, now approaching retirement, carried his own burden. Years of experience told him that predators like Moreland thrived in gaps in technology, in human attention, in systemic processes. He often lamented the lack of centralized databases that could have flagged patterns long before they became tragedies. The thought of young women, vulnerable and unseen, left him with an ache that never faded. By 1991, Moreland had crossed state lines once again, moving to Cleveland, Ohio. There, Claire Donovan, a 21-year-old nursing student, disappeared after leaving her shift at a local hospital. Police reports noted inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, and once again, a lack of physical evidence hampered the investigation. Claire's parents, Thomas and Elaine Donovan, faced the same agony so many others had endured: endless waiting, unanswered questions, and a justice system unable to act decisively. In Louisville, Kentucky, in 1995, Rachel King, a 23-year-old aspiring journalist, vanished after attending a late-night literary reading. Her roommate's frantic report and a police search uncovered nothing, save for scattered papers and an abandoned bicycle near the bus station. By this time, Cole had begun to notice patterns repeating across state lines: young, independent women, vanishing without explanation, leaving behind minimal traces. Each case followed a similar trajectory, yet law enforcement agencies were siloed, and coordination across jurisdictions remained rudimentary. The families of these victims endured profound grief and frustration. They formed support groups, shared tips, and petitioned local authorities for renewed searches, only to meet roadblocks of bureaucratic inertia. Many grew skeptical of law enforcement's willingness or ability to act. For some, hope faded into resignation. For others, grief became a lifelong companion, shaping relationships, careers, and mental health. Cole observed these effects with empathy, but also with frustration. The human cost of procedural failings was becoming increasingly clear. Across the 1980s and 1990s, the limitations of forensic science hampered progress. Fingerprint analysis remained labor-intensive and inconsistent. Blood typing offered only general clues. DNA testing, still in its infancy, could not yet provide the definitive matches that would later revolutionize investigations. The inability to connect cases across state lines meant that patterns remained invisible, allowing Moreland to continue his crimes undetected. Each move he made, each new city he infiltrated, offered him anonymity and opportunity. Cole and Hayes aged alongside the cases. Fiona's youthful optimism was tempered by decades of frustration and heartbreak. Her hands bore the subtle tremor of long nights reviewing files. Her eyes showed the fatigue of years spent chasing leads that yielded little result. Hayes, whose career had once been defined by methodical competence, now carried a weight of regret. He often confided in Cole that he wondered how many lives could have been spared had authorities taken the early warning seriously, or if he himself had acted differently in the early days of Lydia's case. In Concord, police files revealed overlooked clues. A local handyman recalled seeing a man near the cafe the night Jasmine disappeared, nervously watching the patrons. In Buffalo, a neighbor remembered a car repeatedly circling the block the week Sophia vanished. In Cleveland, a street vendor noted a man lingering near the hospital entrance, seemingly memorizing the faces of young women leaving work. Each detail, scattered across jurisdictions, seemed insignificant in isolation, but formed a pattern invisible to the investigators of the time. By 1996, Fiona Cole, now in her early 40s, began to compile a private dossier. She organized files by date, location, and victim profile, drawing careful notes on witness statements, minor details, and unexplained coincidences. She created maps that connected the cities, streets, and neighborhoods where young women had disappeared. Hayes, aware of her efforts, offered what support he could, though his age and health began to limit fieldwork. Together, they acknowledged a frightening reality. The perpetrator, whoever he was, had learned to exploit systemic weaknesses. He moved silently, relied on institutional apathy, and remained invisible while sowing devastation across multiple states. The emotional toll on the investigators mirrored that of the victims' families. Fiona found herself awake late at night, tracing maps, reviewing notes, and imagining each victim's last moments. She questioned every procedural decision made decades ago, ruminated on missed opportunities, and wondered if they would ever have the evidence necessary to link the cases. Hayes, increasingly quiet, watched her diligence with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding that justice might be decades away, yet feeling powerless against the limitations of his era. The victims' families, meanwhile, persisted. Annual vigils, letters to the police, and public appeals filled local newspapers and small community newsletters. Some families clashed with law enforcement, their grief spilling into frustration at a system that seemed incapable of connecting dots across state lines. Others retreated into silence, the burden of unresolved loss too heavy to bear publicly. Across Concord, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Louisville, families carried wounds invisible to most. The lingering pain of loved ones vanished without answers. Amid these decades of frustration, subtle patterns began to emerge. Each victim had been last seen walking alone, often after dark, and often in areas with minimal surveillance. Moreland's adaptability was apparent. He blended into each community, maintaining jobs, volunteering in public spaces, and projecting the image of an ordinary man. These traits allowed him to operate under the radar, exploiting weaknesses in investigative procedures and public perception. For Fiona Cole, the 1990s were a decade of quiet obsession. She began attending national conferences on missing persons and cold cases, learning about emerging technologies and forensic methods that might one day reopen her files with new eyes. Hayes, less comfortable with change, remained a mentor and sounding board, offering historical context and personal experience that helped Cole refine her investigative instincts. Together, they documented every lead, no matter how small, every inconsistent statement, and every potential connection. They could sense the threads of a much larger story, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. By late 1996, the cases remained unresolved, the families still waiting for answers, and Caleb Moreland had effectively disappeared from public view. The absence of an arrest, the repeated failures of interagency collaboration, and the limitations of forensic science allowed him to continue, free to exploit the very gaps that had enabled him to evade capture. Yet, within this darkness, a seed of hope persisted. Cole's meticulous record-keeping, the connections she had begun to draw, and the eventual advancements in technology promised that one day justice could catch up to the man who had haunted decades of women's lives. As the 20th century drew to a close, Fiona Cole reflected on the haunting cycle of disappearance, grief, and institutional failure. She knew that unless something changed, unless new methods, new perspectives, and new technologies were brought to bear, the trail would remain cold, and more lives could be at risk. Hayes, observing the weariness in her eyes, finally admitted what he had feared all along. "We've been chasing shadows, but the predator always knows the gaps in our system." The decade closed with Moreland's presence still unconfirmed but strongly suspected in multiple cases across the Northeast and Midwest. Each family waited, each investigator persevered, and each case laid the groundwork for the eventual breakthrough that would come decades later, when science and persistence would converge in ways previously unimaginable. The haunting thought lingered. How many lives could have been saved if systems had communicated, if evidence had been preserved, if intuition had been acted upon decades earlier? Considering how Caleb Moreland moved undetected across multiple states, what systemic changes do you think could have helped investigators connect these cases sooner? Could earlier interagency collaboration have prevented additional tragedies? The late 1990s in Burlington were a quiet time on the surface. Streets carried the hum of normal life. Students wandered campus quads, and families went about their routines, unaware that somewhere beneath the calm, an invisible thread connected decades of unanswered questions. Detective Fiona Cole had spent 22 years chasing shadows, her nights haunted by the thought of Lydia Hart and the young women who followed her into the darkness. By 1997, she was older, her shoulders a little stooped from long years of carrying cases that never seemed to end. The cold cases that had once been a blot on her conscience now felt like specters, reminding her that failure wasn't simply professional, it was personal. Fiona spent her mornings reviewing old files in the Burlington Police Department's archive room. Dusty folders and yellowed photographs lined the shelves, evidence boxes stacked high. Each file told the same story. Promising lives ended, families left in limbo, leads that vanished without explanation. In the evenings, she would go home to her modest apartment, where the walls were lined with framed photographs of the victims: Lydia, Jasmine Lee, Sophia Ramirez, Claire Donovan, Rachel King, women she had tried to save, or at least honor in memory. The pain of decades of inaction never left her. The city, meanwhile, was slowly awakening to the potential of science. In 2002, Burlington launched its Cold Case Initiative, a program designed to review unresolved cases with fresh eyes, using the latest forensic techniques. It was the first time Fiona felt a cautious glimmer of hope. A young forensic specialist, Dr. Clara Winslow, had been brought in to oversee the project. Clara's reputation preceded her, meticulous, tireless, and innovative. She believed DNA didn't just solve cases, it restored dignity to victims and their families. The partnership between Fiona and Clara was cautious at first. Fiona had learned over decades that new methods didn't always bring answers, but Clara's passion was infectious. Clara began by revisiting Lydia Hart's case. The evidence had been stored in a small, climate-controlled room in the Burlington Police Archives. The wash where Lydia's remains were found had been combed repeatedly in the years following 1979, but modern testing techniques had advanced far beyond what the original investigators had imagined. Swabs from clothing, fingernail scrapings, and hair samples were carefully extracted, catalogued, and sent to Clara's lab. She treated each item as sacred, understanding that every cell could speak if listened to properly. While the laboratory worked its quiet miracles, Fiona met with the families once more. Helen and George Hart were older now, their faces lined with grief that had grown sharper with the passage of time. Simon Hart, Lydia's younger brother, had become a quiet man, carrying the weight of unanswered questions on his broad shoulders. Fiona explained the new initiative, and while the family remained skeptical, they had been promised answers before, they agreed to cooperate, if only to honor Lydia's memory. "It's been nearly 20 years," Helen said, her voice trembling. "But if there's a chance, just a chance, to know what happened, we have to take it. Across the country, in Concord, New Hampshire, Jasmine Lee's parents were contacted. In Buffalo, Sofia Ramirez's extended family gathered to revisit old police reports. Every location where Caleb Moreland had left a mark was being combed anew, and the pattern was starting to become clearer. Fiona found herself charting dates and locations, noting the progression of the killer's movements, the cities, the timelines. Moreland had been methodical, moving every few years, establishing himself quietly in new towns, taking lives without drawing attention. Technology had advanced, yes, but even the slightest misstep could now be illuminated by the meticulous mapping of his pattern. In 2005, Fiona officially retired from the Burlington Police Department. It was a bittersweet moment. Years of sleepless nights and unresolved grief had worn her down, yet the cases she loved so dearly were finally receiving the attention they deserved. She continued as a consultant, visiting the lab regularly, reviewing reports, mentoring young detectives. She could not entirely step away. The cases were woven into the fabric of her life. Detective Samuel Hayes, her old partner, was aging visibly. He had always been a rock of old-school methods, intuition, interviews, and experience, but time had a way of eroding even the sturdiest foundations. In 2008, Samuel passed away quietly at home, leaving Fiona with a profound sense of loss. Their partnership had been complicated, fraught with disagreements, but underneath it had been a shared determination to see justice done. Samuel's death weighed heavily, reminding her that each passing year reduced the number of those who had lived through the earlier failures, those who could offer insight, testimony, or recollection of overlooked details. By 2010, partial DNA matches began to emerge. They were fragments, pieces that did not yet connect to a definitive suspect, but they provided hope. Dr. Winslow carefully explained the limitations to Fiona. "We're getting close," Clara said, her tone both cautious and electric with excitement. "It's like having pieces of a puzzle. We can see parts of the picture, but the edges are still missing." Enter Detective Nathan Pierce. Young, sharp, and trained in modern investigative technology, Nathan brought new energy to the cold case team. He had been hired specifically to focus on integrating old cases with new forensic methods, including genealogical DNA analysis. Where Fiona relied on years of instinct, Nathan relied on algorithms, data mapping, and cross-referencing thousands of DNA samples. At first, Fiona was skeptical. The old ways had a certain intuition that no machine could replicate, but Nathan's results began to speak for themselves. The team reviewed every cold case in the network, cross-referencing dates, locations, and crime scene details. They discovered patterns that had been invisible before. Moreland's victims were not random. They were young, often college-aged women, living alone or commuting to school. He had learned to manipulate, to exploit trust, to select victims where the risk of detection was minimal. His movement from Burlington to Concord, then Buffalo, Cleveland, and Louisville now appeared as a calculated trajectory, as if he had meticulously traced a path through the eastern and midwestern states. Families became vocal participants in this new phase of investigation. Town halls were held, where parents, siblings, and children of victims shared their stories publicly. Some meetings were tense, with frustration boiling over after decades of perceived negligence. Others were quiet, intimate gatherings, where stories of birthdays never celebrated, graduations missed, and lives left unfinished were recounted. Fiona often sat quietly, letting the families speak, taking careful notes, ensuring that every emotional thread was recorded. It was not just science that would solve these cases. It was acknowledgement, remembrance, and the careful piecing together of human experience. In one town hall, Sofia Ramirez's mother broke down as she recounted the night her daughter disappeared. "I was told she probably ran away," she said, tears streaming. "That was what the police said. For 23 years we believed it, until we learned the truth might have been right under their noses." The room was silent, the weight of decades of misbelief palpable. Fiona realized that solving the case wasn't only about DNA, it was about restoring trust, giving these families their lives back in a way they never thought possible. Meanwhile, Nathan Pierce worked tirelessly in the lab. One particularly cold evening, He stayed past midnight, poring over DNA sequences, cross-referencing alleles, and running kinship analysis. He had a hunch, a gut feeling that Moreland's line could be traced through distant relatives in public genetic databases. It was a risky approach, requiring patience and meticulous care to avoid false positives. Hours turned into days. He presented his findings to Fiona and Dr. Winslow. "There's something here," he said. "It's not definitive yet, but the data is pointing us to a family cluster, and it could be our guy." The revelation was met with a mix of excitement and trepidation. For Fiona, it was both the thrill of progress and the reminder that the danger had lingered far too long. Moreland was still out there, or had been until recently, and the thought that he might still have been living quietly somewhere gnawed at her. Dr. Winslow, ever the scientist, emphasized caution. "We need to confirm. Every step must be verified. Lives depend on it." Over the next several months, genealogical DNA analysis reshaped the investigation entirely. The team built out a family tree, identifying potential matches and narrowing down the possibilities. Caleb Moreland had left a legacy of terror, but he had also left clues in the very bloodlines that connected him to distant relatives. Each step was painstaking, requiring careful cross-referencing with decades of records, old police reports, and archived evidence. While the science advanced, Fiona maintained contact with the families. She updated them on every breakthrough, every tentative match, every potential lead. Parents who had long ago stopped hoping began to breathe a little easier, though the fear of disappointment remained. Many families organized support groups, offering solace to one another, creating networks of advocacy that had been missing for decades. In Concord, New Hampshire, Jasmine Lee's younger brother, now a man in his 30s, visited the police station for the first time in nearly 27 years. He brought old journals, photographs, and a notebook of memories about his sister. "She was brilliant," he said, voice breaking. "She wanted to study environmental science. I just want to know who did this. I want someone to answer for what they took from us." Fiona listened, quietly documenting everything. These personal artifacts became key pieces of the investigation, bridging gaps where DNA alone could not speak. By 2012, the combination of traditional detective work, familial insights, and genealogical DNA had reshaped the entire investigation. Caleb Moreland, once a faceless figure in case files, now had threads connecting him to every confirmed victim. Each step forward sent shockwaves through the investigative team and the families alike. For the first time, the narrative began to shift, from unresolved tragedy to a story that could finally be solved. Yet, even with the breakthroughs, Moreland remained a specter. Fiona, Nathan, and Dr. Winslow understood the danger of premature conclusions. Every DNA match had to be confirmed, every lead corroborated, and every hypothesis rigorously tested. The work was exhausting, emotionally and physically, but each small step was a triumph over decades of inaction and failure. As the year drew to a close, the team gathered to review their findings. Fiona, standing beside Nathan and Clara, looked over a map dotted with the locations of confirmed and suspected victims. The realization was both horrifying and empowering. They had reconstructed Moreland's path, understood his method, and had the tools to finally end his reign of terror. The suspense was palpable. The next steps would require careful planning, coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies, and a precise application of the evidence they had painstakingly collected. The cold Vermont winter pressed against the windows of the lab, the world outside indifferent to the lives that had been lost and the years that had been stolen. Inside, Fiona felt a rare spark of hope. For the first time in decades, the investigation had direction. DNA had woken the dead, but it was the diligence, persistence, and unwavering commitment of human investigators that would finally give the victims a voice. As she left the lab that evening, Fiona paused to glance at the photograph of Lydia Hart pinned to her office wall. Lydia's eyes seemed almost alive, watching, waiting. Fiona whispered a silent promise. "We will find him. We will tell your story. We will make this right." And as the snow began to fall gently on Burlington streets, a sense of cautious optimism settled over the team. The breakthrough was near. But the work was only beginning. The shadow of Caleb Morland loomed larger than ever in their minds. Who was he really? How had he evaded justice for so long? And most urgently, how could they ensure he would finally be held accountable before more time, more lives, and more families were lost to history? If you were part of the team working on a decades-old cold case like this, what would you prioritize first? Advancing the DNA analysis, interviewing surviving family members, or reviewing the original investigation files? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. By 2013, the investigation into the decades-long trail of disappearances and murders connected to Lydia Hart and the other women had evolved from a story of hopeless cold cases into a cautious tale of rising hope. The Burlington Police Department, spurred by pressure from families and the public, had invested in modern forensic technology, and Dr. Clara Winslow had become the linchpin of the effort. Her meticulous work with DNA and her insistence on re-examining old evidence created a renewed sense of purpose for Detective Nathan Pierce, who had been brought on to bring fresh eyes and contemporary investigative techniques to what many had long assumed were unsolvable cases. Nathan was methodical, driven by the stories of the women who had been silenced, and by the decades of pain experienced by families who had been left with nothing but unanswered questions. He would often sit in his office late into the night, flipping through old case files, examining photographs, reading letters written by mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. These weren't statistics. They were lives stolen. And while he was keenly aware that time was working against him, the memories of witnesses fading, the evidence aging, he also knew that technology had finally caught up to the investigation in ways it never had before. Dr. Winslow had begun sequencing all preserved evidence from Lydia Hart, Jasmine Lee, Sophia Ramirez, Claire Donovan, and Rachel King. The process was painstaking. Many of the samples had degraded over the years, leaving only fragments of DNA. But by 2014, the advent of genealogical DNA and the increasingly sophisticated methods of analysis meant that even the smallest biological trace could be cross-referenced against family trees, public records, and DNA databases. Winslow worked tirelessly, often late into the night in a small lab filled with centrifuges, freezers, and computers, humming with analysis software. Every match, every partial sequence, felt like a small victory in a decades-long war against silence and oblivion. Meanwhile, the families of the victims had begun to organize themselves, joining advocacy groups, attending town halls, and lobbying for resources. Lydia Hart's parents, Helen and George, had aged considerably since her disappearance in 1977. They now spoke at community meetings, recounting the failures of the original investigation and urging local authorities to give the cold case unit the resources it desperately needed. Simon Hart, Lydia's younger brother, had thrown himself into the effort, compiling timelines, cross-referencing public records, and speaking to journalists in hopes of keeping his sister's story alive. The families of Jasmine Lee, Sophia Ramirez, Claire Donovan, and Rachel King did the same, often communicating through private groups that allowed them to share frustrations, information, and support. These networks of survivors and families became instrumental in keeping pressure on law enforcement and ensuring that the investigation could not be quietly shelved. Detective Fiona Cole, now retired from active duty, continued to provide her insights as a consultant. Though she had stepped back from day-to-day investigative work, her knowledge of procedural missteps from the original cases in the late 1970s and 1980s remained invaluable. She had watched colleagues stumble over jurisdictional disputes, interstate communication failures, and the widespread complacency that had allowed Caleb Morland to evade detection for so long. Her advice was practical and often brutally honest. "Never forget that the system will always favor its own," she reminded Nathan. "Your loyalty belongs to the victims, not to the department or the office politics." The breakthrough began subtly. Partial DNA matches emerged that linked two previously disconnected cases. Sophia Ramirez's remains, preserved carefully in the Buffalo archives, provided enough DNA to establish a familial link to unidentified samples found at the scenes of Claire Donovan and Rachel King. It was the first tangible connection across state lines in decades. Dr. Winslow spent weeks painstakingly confirming the sequences, double-checking for contamination, and correlating the results with genealogical data. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The pattern was undeniable. The same perpetrator had traveled extensively, leaving a trail of destroyed lives across multiple states. Public interest in the cases surged. Town halls in Burlington, Concord, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Louisville were packed with community members who demanded accountability, transparency, and results. Families shared their stories publicly, finally able to name the women who had been victims and describe the pain and frustration that had been part of their lives for decades. At one such town hall in Burlington, Helen Hart's voice trembled as she described the moment she realized her daughter's disappearance had never been investigated properly. "We were told to move on," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But there is no moving on when your child is missing, when the system fails you every step of the way." I refused to let her story end in silence. As these hearings and public discussions progressed, Detective Pierce focused on narrowing the suspect pool. Caleb Moreland, whose name had occasionally surfaced in old witness statements and small pieces of circumstantial evidence, began to emerge as a person of interest. The challenge was significant. Moreland had moved multiple times, established himself in various communities, and had skillfully avoided drawing attention to himself. He had lived in Concord, NH, during Jasmine Lee's disappearance in 1983, Buffalo during Sophia Ramirez's in 1987, Cleveland during Claire Donovan's in 1991, and Louisville during Rachel King's in 1995. These relocations were carefully timed to avoid overlap with any existing leads, a chilling testament to the calculated nature of his crimes. The investigators now faced the logistical nightmare of piecing together Moreland's history. They examined employment records, tax filings, credit card activity, phone directories, and even small personal details, memberships in clubs, volunteer activities, and travel logs. Each detail, once seemingly irrelevant, now became crucial for establishing patterns, placing Moreland near each victim at critical times. The challenge was compounded by decades of inconsistent record-keeping and lost documentation. Yet, with the persistence of Dr. Winslow's forensic work and Pierce's analytical skills, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to converge. While the detectives focused on the forensic trail, the human element of the story remained central. Families continued to grapple with their trauma, often reliving the events of decades ago with each new revelation. Simon Hart, after learning of the DNA link to other victims, spent sleepless nights oscillating between relief and renewed grief. Relief that their daughter's case was finally gaining momentum. Grief that the killer had taken the lives of so many others, leaving families in the same painful limbo. At the same time, communities began to hold vigils and small memorials, not just in Burlington but in the cities where other victims had lived, honoring women who had been neglected by the justice system for far too long. Tension heightened in 2015 when Dr. Winslow announced that DNA evidence had not only connected the previous victims, but suggested a broader pattern potentially involving additional unsolved cases. The prospect of dozens more families waiting for answers introduced both urgency and apprehension. Detective Pierce worked tirelessly, coordinating with police departments across multiple states, often contending with bureaucratic inertia, lost evidence, and resistance from those uncomfortable with reopening decades-old cases. Fiona Cole's guidance remained invaluable during this period. Her knowledge of old investigative errors prevented duplication of mistakes that had plagued earlier attempts. The narrative of Caleb Moreland's life, pieced together from decades of records, began to reveal not just a history of relocation, but a portrait of calculated manipulation. Moreland had maintained an unassuming exterior, cultivating a reputation as a model citizen, careful to avoid overt suspicion. He had secured positions of trust, volunteered in local organizations, and created networks that insulated him from scrutiny. Yet, beneath this facade, he left an indelible mark on the communities he inhabited. Pierce often noted that the true horror was not just in the murders themselves, but in the systematic way Moreland had evaded detection, exploiting gaps in law enforcement and societal trust. Despite the weight of decades-old trauma, a sense of anticipation grew among the families. They watched closely as investigative threads began converging. Town halls and local news outlets followed every development, amplifying the community's demand for accountability. This public pressure played a crucial role, ensuring that agencies could not quietly abandon the case and providing the moral reinforcement investigators often needed when facing bureaucratic pushback. By 2017, the team was focusing intensely on genealogical DNA. Dr. Winslow had successfully narrowed the suspect pool to the Moreland bloodline. Using a combination of public databases, family tree analysis, and cross-referencing known movements, investigators began mapping Moreland's presence across decades and states. The breakthroughs were painstaking and slow, but each small victory, confirmation of a residence, verification of employment, trace evidence, pushed them closer to the moment of confrontation. Community engagement remained central. Families created advocacy panels, wrote letters to policymakers, and collaborated with media outlets to maintain attention on the investigation. Their efforts were not just for themselves, but for the wider message that institutional failures of the past could not be repeated, and that vigilance could prevent future tragedies. Each testimony, each public appeal, reminded law enforcement and the public that the victims were more than case files. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and human beings whose stories demanded justice. The tension reached a climax in late 2018. Surveillance plans were meticulously coordinated to monitor Moreland, who had been living quietly in Denver, CO, seemingly unaware of the growing scrutiny. Investigators had to balance caution with urgency, knowing that any misstep could allow him to disappear again. The entire team worked around the clock. Dr. Winslow analyzing DNA from minute traces, Pierce coordinating with multiple agencies, retired Detective Cole consulting to ensure no procedural errors were repeated. The breakthrough came when investigators identified a discarded item, a coffee cup left outside a local cafe, linked definitively to Caleb Moreland. Dr. Winslow processed the item, extracting DNA that matched the previously confirmed profiles of the victims. It was the evidence needed to solidify Moreland's connection to the crimes. The operation to apprehend him was swift and precise, coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies to prevent any chance of escape. In early 2019, Caleb Moreland was officially identified as the suspect behind a trail of murders spanning over 4 decades. The culmination of meticulous investigative work, technological advances, and relentless family advocacy had finally borne fruit. Arrest plans were set in motion, with law enforcement prepared to bring decades of unresolved trauma to a close. The arrest would ultimately occur in early 2020, but by the end of 2019, the emotional and investigative groundwork was complete. Families gathered in quiet anticipation, some for the first time in decades, feeling that the possibility of justice was no longer a distant dream. This period of the investigation was a testament to the endurance of human perseverance. It highlighted the transformative power of modern forensic science while underscoring the importance of institutional transparency, collaboration across states, and the tireless advocacy of victims' families. It demonstrated that even in cases long considered cold, hope could persist when individuals refused to accept silence, evasion, or bureaucratic complacency as an endpoint. As the year drew to a close, the final pieces of the puzzle were in place. Investigators had reconstructed Moreland's movements, corroborated familial DNA connections, and prepared for the operational phase that would lead to his arrest. Families felt a cautious optimism, tempered by the knowledge that even the arrest would not erase decades of pain. Yet, the investigation had proven that justice, delayed though it may be, was possible. If you were part of the investigative team, facing decades-old cases with minimal leads, what strategy would you prioritize first? Focusing on modern DNA technology, re-interviewing witnesses, or digging into historical records? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By early 2020, Caleb Moreland's arrest had sent ripples through the communities that had been scarred by his decades-long crime spree. For families who had spent decades grappling with unanswered questions, his capture brought a bittersweet sense of relief. The magnitude of the case, the extensive reach of his crimes across state lines, the failures of law enforcement over decades, and the courage of those who refused to let these women's stories fade, was overwhelming. Detective Nathan Pierce felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. Years of painstaking work, re-examining evidence, chasing down genealogical leads, and coordinating with departments across multiple states had finally led to this moment. Yet, he knew that arresting Moreland was only the beginning. What lay ahead was navigating the complex machinery of the justice system, ensuring that the evidence could withstand scrutiny, and preparing for what promised to be a high-profile and emotionally charged trial. The legal team assembled quickly. Prosecutor Victoria Lane, known for her unwavering commitment to victims' rights, took the lead. She understood that this trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a chance to confront decades of systemic failure, and an opportunity to finally give the victims and their families a voice. Daniel Cross, a seasoned defense attorney, was appointed to represent Moreland. Though he carried out his professional duty with diligence, he could not obscure the gravity of the crimes that were about to be laid bare before a court and the public. The courtroom in Denver, CO, was prepared to handle the magnitude of the case. Journalists from across the nation had been granted access to cover the proceedings. Victims' families, some of whom had never previously set foot in a courthouse during these decades, took their seats with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. They were there to bear witness, to insist that the lives of their daughters, sisters, and mothers be remembered, and to confront the man who had taken them. Opening statements were delivered with precision and intensity. Victoria Lane presented the narrative that would guide the trial, methodically laying out the chain of evidence, forensic DNA, witness statements, travel and residence patterns, and the painstakingly documented timeline of Moreland's movements across multiple states over 4 decades. Lane's voice, steady and controlled, emphasized the perseverance and diligence required to bring the case to this point. She reminded the court that these women had been silenced for far too long, and that justice, though delayed, could still be served. As the prosecution began presenting evidence, it became clear how meticulous the work had been. DNA sequences were cross-referenced, matched to family members, and linked to Moreland in multiple jurisdictions. Surveillance records from 2019 were introduced, showing how the discarded coffee cup, carefully preserved and processed, had provided the final incontrovertible link. Every piece of evidence told a story not just of a crime, but of systemic failures, human perseverance, and the courage of those who refused to accept silence. Families were invited to give impact statements, a moment that would prove both cathartic and deeply emotional. Helen Hart took the podium first. Her voice trembled as she recounted the day Lydia had vanished in 1977, the years spent navigating a system that seemed indifferent, and the relief and grief she felt now that Moreland had finally been caught. "We were told to move on," she said, eyes glistening. "But you can never truly move on when your child has been taken from you. Today, at least, we are heard. Today, there is acknowledgement of the pain that has haunted our family for more than 40 years. Simon Hart followed, recounting memories of his sister's laughter, her ambition, and the moments that defined her as a person beyond the tragedy of her disappearance. "We never wanted fame," he said softly. "We only wanted the truth. We wanted someone to care. For decades, it felt like the world turned its back on her. Today, we finally feel a measure of justice." Other families spoke as well. Anita and Richard Lee described their daughter Jasmine, her bright intellect, and the countless plans she had for her future now cut short. Karen Lee, Jasmine's younger sister, addressed the courtroom with quiet dignity, emphasizing how this case had not just impacted their family but had inspired advocacy and awareness about how victims of violence are treated, especially when the perpetrators exploit societal trust. Maria and Luis Ramirez shared their story of Sophia, the vibrant young woman whose life had been extinguished in Buffalo. They spoke of the decades spent wondering why no one had listened, how they had learned to navigate a world that sometimes refused to acknowledge the pain of those left behind. Diego Ramirez, Sophia's brother, spoke about the resilience required to continue living while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Patricia and Edward Donovan recounted the story of Claire, her dreams, her friendships, and the community impact of her disappearance. Emily Donovan, her sister, spoke of the long nights spent hoping for news, the emotional toll of uncertainty, and the profound relief at finally seeing legal action take place. Deborah and Thomas King, parents of Rachel King, provided the final testimony in the emotional segment. Their voice was steady, but heavy with grief, reflecting both loss and the fragile hope that justice might finally bring closure. Michael King, Rachel's brother, emphasized the importance of remembering the victims as full human beings, not statistics. He spoke of the memorials, scholarships, and advocacy programs inspired by the cases and how their family had found purpose in activism, ensuring that future victims would be believed and supported. The trial progressed over several weeks. Witnesses, forensic experts, and investigators provided testimony. Detective Nathan Pierce recounted the painstaking reconstruction of Moreland's movements, the painstaking genealogical work of Dr. Clara Winslow, and the collaborative efforts across state lines. Pierce's voice, calm yet unwavering, detailed the investigative hurdles, the moments of frustration, and the breakthroughs that had ultimately led to Moreland's apprehension. Throughout the trial, Caleb Moreland remained largely unreactive, his expression cold, yet the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The meticulous documentation of his actions, the forensic evidence connecting him to multiple victims, and the overwhelming testimony of family members made any defense difficult to sustain. Eventually, faced with the impossibility of contesting the evidence, Moreland confessed to multiple murders. His confession was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery, but provided a final clarity to a story that had spanned decades. The courtroom remained silent as his words echoed. For the families, the confession was both a relief and a devastating confirmation of the horrors they had long suspected. For law enforcement, it was validation of years of relentless pursuit, an affirmation of the importance of patience, diligence, and refusing to let systemic failures dictate outcomes. In the aftermath of the confession and subsequent conviction, the impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. States initiated comprehensive reviews of cold case policies, examining how decades of inaction had allowed Moreland to evade justice. Law enforcement agencies implemented reforms, including mandatory cold case audits, improved interstate communication protocols, and enhanced training in recognizing patterns of serial offending. The systemic reforms were slow but meaningful, a recognition that institutional failures could no longer be ignored. Detectives Fiona Cole and Nathan Pierce were formally credited for their perseverance. Cole, though retired, attended the post-trial ceremonies, reflecting on how far investigative methods had come since her early days on Lydia Hart's case. She noted that while technology had been critical, the persistence of human investigators, the courage of families, and the willingness of communities to demand accountability were equally crucial to the resolution. Pierce, now recognized as a leading authority in cold case investigations, emphasized that no case should be considered too old to solve and no victim too distant to matter. The community response was profound. Memorials were held for all victims, from Lydia Hart in Burlington to Rachel King in Louisville. The memorials were more than commemorations. They were affirmations of life, recognition of loss, and pledges to ensure that future generations would not experience similar institutional neglect. At the Burlington Memorial, a scholarship fund was established in Lydia Hart's name, supporting aspiring women educators. The ceremony drew families, friends, students, and community members, all paying tribute to a young woman whose life had been tragically cut short, but whose legacy now inspired hope and action. Over the next few years, the ripple effects of the case continued to manifest. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states used the methodologies refined during the Moreland investigation to reopen cold cases, solve long-standing mysteries, and provide closure to families who had been left waiting for decades. Educational seminars were established for detectives, emphasizing the importance of following evidence without prejudice, maintaining meticulous records, and prioritizing victims over departmental reputation. Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigative journalist who had chronicled the case from its early stages in the 2000s, observed how the narrative had shifted. No longer was the story only about a killer. It was about systemic change, the power of perseverance, and the undeniable impact of community advocacy. She wrote about the lessons learned, that institutions must be held accountable, that victims' voices matter, and that justice, even delayed by decades, was worth fighting for. By 2023, the final pieces of the public reckoning were in place. Moreland remained incarcerated, his crimes documented in exhaustive detail, his name forever associated with one of the most extensive series of cold case investigations in modern U.S. history. Families had established foundations, scholarships, and memorials, ensuring that the victims were remembered not as statistics, but as individuals whose lives mattered. Detective Cole continued to mentor young officers, emphasizing the importance of empathy, diligence, and refusing to accept complacency. Detective Pierce trained new cold case units, sharing methodologies, successes, and lessons learned from the multi-state investigation. The Burlington Memorial Park had evolved into a living tribute. Flowering trees, benches, and engraved plaques commemorated each victim. Visitors left notes, photographs, and personal tokens, connecting the memory of those lost to the ongoing work of advocacy and awareness. It was a space not just for mourning, but for reflection, education, and the quiet resolve that the failures of the past would inform a better future. Families, though forever scarred by loss, found solace in the knowledge that their daughters' stories had been told, that accountability had been demanded, and that their courage had inspired change. Helen Hart, often reflective, said quietly to Nathan Pierce during a memorial visit, "We never imagined it would take decades, but today it matters. Their lives mattered. And now, the world knows it." The final chapter of the investigation was both professional and personal. It highlighted the complex interplay between technological advances, investigative persistence, systemic accountability, and the human capacity for hope. From the initial disappearance of Lydia Hart in 1977 to the arrest and conviction of Caleb Moreland decades later, the case had endured failures, bureaucratic inertia, and countless obstacles. Yet, it also demonstrated that with persistence, collaboration, and empathy, even the most cold and distant cases could be resolved. As the sun set over Burlington, families gathered one last time in a quiet ceremony at the memorial. They read names, shared memories, and reaffirmed their commitment to advocacy and remembrance. It was a poignant moment, simultaneously sorrowful and hopeful, underscoring the enduring impact of loss and the transformative potential of justice. If you could implement one reform in law enforcement today to prevent such systemic failures, what would it be? Share your ideas in the comments below, and let's discuss how we can ensure victims are always prioritized over institutional protection. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.